Has Israel engaged in genocide against Palestinian civilians? I will demonstrate to you in this audio that no other nation faced with comparable threats, both external and internal, while being protective of enemy civilians, willing to take risks for peace, and committed to the rule of law than Israel. The proof is 3/4 of a century. You'll see that in the Arab-Israeli wars, the Arab side exhibits genocidal aggression against civilians, while the Jewish side exhibits determination to protect its civilian population by taking defensive actions directed against military targets on the other side. In these wars, the Arab side has consistently, illegally and aggressively targeted civilians, while the Israeli side has consistently, lawfully and defensively responded by attacking military targets. It began in 1929. There was a well-planned and coordinated massacre of 60 Jewish children, women, old people, and other unarmed civilian residents of the biblical city of Hebron, in which Jews had lived peacefully and continually from time immemorial. The 1929 massacre was a harbinger of civilian massacres to come, much like Kristallnacht 9 years later, also called the November pogrom, a pogrom against Jews carried out by the Nazi Party and paramilitary forces along with participation from the Hitler Youth and German civilians throughout Nazi Germany in November 1938. It portended the Holocaust. In the 1929 massacre, all the Jews of Hebron were either murdered or transferred out of the city, in which Jews had lived for millennia. Between 1948 and 1967, Palestinian Fedayeen militants, sponsored by Egypt and Syria, murdered Israeli civilians in hundreds cross-border raids. These murders took place before Israel built any settlements outside of the area pursuant to the United Nations partitions and the ceasefire that followed the 1948 attack against the newly established Jewish state. In the 1967 war, every single Arab army, including the Egyptian, Syrian, Palestinian, Jordanian and Iraqi armies, targeted Israeli civilian population centers in violation of the laws of war. As previously documented, Syrian artillery and MiG fighter jets opened fire on Israeli towns, kibbutzim and moshevim. Jordan rained 6,000 rockets on western Jerusalem and the suburbs of Tel Aviv, while its Hawker Hunter fighter jets dropped bombs on Netanya, Kfar Sirkin and Kfar Saba. Iraqi fighter jets strafed Afula and the civilian towns in the Jezreel Valley in the northern district of Israel. Damascus radio bragged that the Syrian Air Force was bombing Israeli cities. Jordanian forces were instructed to destroy all buildings and kill everyone present, including civilians. Palestinian battle plans included the destruction of Israel and its inhabitants. Egyptian battle plans included the massacre of the Tel Aviv civilian population as the first step toward the destruction of Israel. Posters and images in Cairo News showed Arab soldiers shooting, crushing, strangling and dismembering bearded, hook-nosed Jews. In sharp contrast, Israel did not target innocent civilians, although it certainly had the capacity to retaliate against the bombing of its civilian population centers. Israel threatened to bomb Amman and Damascus during the 1967 war if Jordanian and Syrian forces persisted in bombing Israeli cities. But it never did so. It bombed air bases, tank convoys, and other legitimate military targets despite the fact that the enemies targeted Israeli citizens throughout the war. The number of casualties among Arab civilians was remarkably low, because Israel's military actions were conducted far from major population centers. On the other side, since the end of the 1967 war, the entire focus of Palestinian aggression has been on civilians both inside Israel and around the world. Global terrorism began in 1968. Not as a last resort against a long occupation, but as a first resort, really as a continuation of an illegal and immoral tactic that had been continuously used by the Arabs against the Jews since the beginning of the conflict. Targeting civilians was not a result of the occupation. To the contrary, the occupation was the result, at least in part, of a long Arab history of massacring civilians. Yet those, such as the poet Tom Paulin, who praise and support terrorists who murder Jews, are invited to speak on college campuses as honored guests. Palestinian civilians have died in the 73-year-long war, but their numbers have been infinitesimal in comparison with the number of Palestinians and Arabs killed by Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Iran during this same period. Moreover, the Palestinian deaths have resulted primarily from terrorists hiding among their own civilians, as in Lebanon and Gaza, whereas the Israeli deaths have resulted from innocent civilians being specifically targeted. When Palestinians have been accidentally killed in a legitimate effort to prevent terrorism, Israel has expressed genuine regret. The murder of innocent Israelis, on the other hand, has generated celebration among Palestinians. In 1994, a deranged Jewish man named Baruch Goldstein from Hebron machine-gunned 29 Muslims at prayer. Goldstein's individual terrorist attack against Palestinian civilians was strongly condemned by the Israeli government and the overwhelming majority of Israelis and Jews throughout the world. This is in sharp contrast to the Palestinian reaction to their martyrs, who blow up innocent Israelis and Jews. These people are praised and their families are rewarded for their well-planned crimes. In April 2002, following hundreds of suicide bombings that culminated in the Passover Seder massacre of 29 Jewish women, children and men at prayer, the Israeli army entered the Jenin refugee camp, which has become a bomb-making factory and terrorist center. Instead of bombing the terrorists' camp from the air, as the United States did in Afghanistan, and as Russia did in Chechnya with little risk to their own soldiers, but much to civilians, Israel instead had its infantrymen enter the camp, going house to house in search of terrorists and bomb-making equipment, which they found. 23 Israeli soldiers and 52 Palestinians, most of whom were combatants, were killed. This is now called a massacre by Palestinian propagandists. The hypocritical Palestinian cry of a Jenin massacre persists, and it is supported by the head of the United Nations Refugee Agency UNRWA, Peter Hansen, a long-time apologist for and facilitator of terrorism. He characterized Israel's actions in Jenin as a human rights catastrophe that has few parallels in recent history. Not only was Jenin not a massacre or an unparalleled catastrophe, but it is regarded by many as a model of how to conduct urban warfare against terrorists hiding among civilians. Examples of Israel being regarded as a model of how to conduct urban warfare can be found in two articles. An article in the June 2003 issue of Atlantic Monthly by a leading expert on terrorism at the Rand Corporation focused on the lessons America must learn from how Israel deals with terrorism. And an article in the Boston Globe analyzed the ethical training received by Israeli soldiers and concluded that the Israeli Defense Force Army offers a model for us and other coalition forces. It described the Israeli concept of purity of arms, which requires that soldiers put their own lives at stake in order to avoid harming non-combatants. It also requires them to respond only with proportional force. The Israeli Defense Force Ethical Code, which is incorporated into the training of all Israeli soldiers, was compiled with the assistance of some of the country's leading moral philosophers. It requires every soldier to act out of a recognition of the supreme value of human life and commands them to do all in their power to avoid causing harm to non-combatants' lives, bodies, dignity, and property, and refrain from obeying blatantly illegal orders. One of the members of the team who drafted the code is a well-known peace advocate, Professor Moshe Halbertal. He recognizes that the strategy of the Palestinians in the Intifada has been to erase the distinction between combatants and non-combatants on both sides, by targeting Israeli civilians and having Palestinian terrorists blend into the Palestinian civilian population. Nonetheless, he sees the challenge to Israel as directing its defensive measures against those who instigate. A daunting challenge indeed, with a Palestinian population that contains thousands upon thousands of instigators, facilitators, harborers, and agents. Israel has met that challenge better than any nation that has faced comparable dangers. Two stories illustrate the Israeli commitment to proportionality and to avoiding unnecessary civilian casualties. The first involves an Israeli attack directed against Salah Shehada, a leading Hamas commander who was responsible for hundreds of terrorist bombings. On several occasions, the army passed up opportunities to attack him because he was with his wife or children. Each time Shehada's life was spared, he directed more suicide bombings against Israel. In other words, Israel was prepared to risk the lives of its own civilians in order to spare the lives of Palestinian civilians. The second story was related by the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Force, Moshe Yalen. It involves an intelligence officer who has prevented the Air Force from attacking a Palestinian target by withholding necessary information. The officer had believed mistakenly that the operation would put civilians at risk. From the moral point of view, he deserves a commendation. From the operational one, he deserves to be removed from his post. The Chief of Staff added that he was proud that we have officers who take their moral responsibility so seriously. Tossing and turning at night is typical of Israeli soldiers who must make life and death decisions constrained by a rigid code of conduct. Their decisions are not always the right ones. Mistakes inevitably occur in the fog of war, especially when terrorists deliberately hide behind civilians in order to provoke mistakes that add to the body count, a count that is central to their cruel arithmetic of death. Although Israeli soldiers make mistakes and overreact like soldiers in every army, at least there is an ethical code against which their actions can be judged. Palestinian terrorists have no similar constraints. Their orders are to kill and maim as many innocent civilians as possible, and they do so with zeal, and with a promise of a heavenly bounty for every Jewish child and woman who is murdered. Israel, like America, is trying to fight battles by having an appropriate balance between self-defense and undue risk to innocent civilians. In addition to the code of ethics by which all Israeli soldiers are trained, the Supreme Court of Israel, unique among the world's judiciaries, exercises control over military decisions that are challenged under the rule of law as creating undue risks to civilians. Consider, for example, the following choice of evils conundrum faced by the Israeli military when it is seeking to apprehend an armed terrorist who is holed up in a home. If the soldiers approach the home and knock down the door, they risk being shot by the terrorists, as many soldiers have been. So the army devised a tactic called the neighbor procedure, pursuant to which they first demanded the surrender of the terrorist over a loudspeaker. If that produced no results, they sent a Palestinian neighbor to the house, bearing a message to the terrorist asking him to surrender. According to the Israeli Defense Force, this neighbor procedure worked effectively for more than 20 years, saving the lives of many Israeli soldiers as well as of Palestinians who were being held in the house with the terrorist. In the summer of 2002, the procedure resulted in the first casualty of a Palestinian man named Nidal Abu Mekison, who was shot and killed by a terrorist. The Israeli army had given Mekison a bulletproof vest, but it did not save him. As a result of this tragedy, in which a Palestinian civilian took a terrorist bullet intended for an Israeli soldier, several Israeli rights organizations brought a lawsuit seeking to have the Supreme Court avoid any further use of the neighbor procedure. No other Supreme Court in the world would even hear such a case, especially not during an ongoing war. The Supreme Court of Israel not only heard the case, but issued Israeli Defense Force from using this procedure in the future, even when the field commander believes that it poses little risk to the civilian and could save the lives of his soldiers. The point is not whether this decision is right or wrong, but rather that the Supreme Court of Israel is ordering the military to make its time-tested procedures comply with the rules of law. It becomes eminently clear that no country in the modern history of warfare has been more protective of the rights of innocent, non-combatant enemies than Israel. I challenge anyone to name a country that has faced comparable attacks on its civilian population and has responded with more solicitude toward its enemy civilians at such great risk to its own soldiers. Certainly not Great Britain or the United States, which bombed enemy cities, or France or Russia, which did worse. Israel is the only country in the history of modern warfare that has never dropped bombs indiscriminately on an enemy city or country in an effort to kill innocent civilians in retaliation for the deliberate bombing of its own civilians. Even when it attacked those parts of Beirut that were home to terrorists, the Israeli Air Force made great efforts, although not always with success, to avoid unnecessary civilian casualties. Recall that when Israel sought to protect itself against Beirut-based terrorism in 1982, it sent in a team of soldiers, led by then Major General Ehud Barak, dressed as a woman, to target the terrorists in a building used as their base, instead of bombing the building from the air, which would have resulted in many more casualties. This is typical of the Israeli approach to targeting terrorism. So to characterize Israel's self-defense actions, even overreactions, as genocide, or to compare them to Nazi atrocities, is to engage in a not-so-subtle form of international anti-Semitism against the Jewish nation. Israel should be compared with the United States in that both countries make significant efforts to train their troops to avoid civilian casualties and do not always succeed. And as described earlier, Israel makes even a greater effort than the United States in avoiding civilian casualties. In her book, Just War Against Terror, University of Chicago philosopher Jean Beth Gelstein sharply contrasts the training films shown to United States soldiers with the training films being widely used to recruit Islamic terrorists. United States military training films include generous helpings of what went wrong in various operations, not only to United States military losses, but also to operations that led to the unintentional loss of civilian life. These films ask, how can such losses be prevented in the future? No one is told to call the killing of civilians as God's will, or even worse, an act carried out in God's name. To give you a contrast example, the training videos shown to recruit Islamic militants and terrorists, which is routine fare in many radical mosques, shows enemies being decapitated with knives after they are disarmed, something strictly forbidden by the laws of war. The film's narrator intones, you have to kill in the name of Allah until you are killed. Then you will win your place forever in paradise. The flag of jihad will be forever held high. Our enemies are fighting in the name of Satan. You are fighting in the name of God. You can indeed see the stark difference. Also, If you look at the comparisons with the Russians in Chechnya and the French in Algeria, the United States and Israel have conducted themselves far better than other countries confronting terrorism and urban warfare. My point goes back to the international community's portrayal of Israel as a unique or prime violator of human rights, when any objective comparative assessment will prove that its overall record is among the best in the world, perhaps the best in the world when the circumstances they face are taken into account. Look at the wars that Israel had to deal with. The self-proclaimed Arab War of Extermination in 1948, also known as Nakba. Then the targeting of Israeli cities by Arab armies during the 1967 and 1973 wars, and the continuous terrorist attacks that have killed thousands of Israeli, Jewish, and other civilians, can be characterized as attempted genocide of the Jews in Israel. Israel's efforts to protect its citizens from these mass murders by attacking Arab military targets can only be labeled as genocide by a bigot. Perhaps nothing more can be expected of Professor Boyle, who has long been a one-sided propagandist for Palestinian terrorism. But more is certainly expected of a Nobel Prize-winning author such as José Saramago, who recently characterized Israeli efforts to defend its citizens against terrorism as crime comparable to Auschwitz. When Saramago was pressed about where the gas chambers are, he responded, "Not here yet." This revolting comment is nothing short of obscene, and can only be explained by abysmal ignorance or a deep-seated and irrational hatred for the Jewish state. But ignorance alone cannot explain the alleged reporting of a journalist like Chris Hedges, who claimed to have personally observed Israeli soldiers entice children like mice into a trap and murder them for sport. This sort of reporting belongs alongside the report that appeared in the Saudi newspaper Al Riyadh on March 10, 2022, describing the nonsense that the Jews used the blood of Christian and Muslim children under the age of 10 to prepare pastries for their holidays. Now, after learning all this, you can make your own conclusions. Has Israel engaged in genocide against Palestinian civilians? You now know that the answer is no, and you are now more equipped with facts and history knowledge to combat propaganda and misinformation, even when the sources of that misinformation may appear credible, as just described.